There is something profoundly wrong when the top 0.1% owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%, and when 99% of all new income goes to the top 1%.
Of course, one government policy leads to the next. If you raise the minimum wage, then it's going to raise the rents. When it raises the rents, you're going to have to build affordable housing. When you have to build affordable housing, you have to tax people to build the affordable housing. When you tax people to build the affordable housing, people move out of the city, and you have to raise taxes on the people who remain in the city, and this is how you hollow out the economy of a major metropolitan area in the United States.
The deepest questions, the darkest intuitions. This is The Moral Trigger.
So this episode will be slightly different from the others in that what you're about to hear is a discussion that I had with Stevie James, and he is a television correspondent at the Alternative Press, and he identifies himself as an anarcho-capitalist. So I hope that gives you a couple ideas of what's about to come. This conversation was about socialism and capitalism, and the differences between socialism and communism, and all the dark aspects that go into the economic system / political theory. And this conversation is a bit one-sided in that you are mostly hearing the negative aspects of socialism. However, I want to say that I will be having conversations in the future with people who don't exactly agree with this. So with the rise of socialist opinion in America, especially among my generation, the millennials, I wanted to basically have a conversation about why this may not exactly be the best thing. This is obviously a very hot subject, and I really want to know what you guys have to think. Real quick, before we get going, I want to make a note and say that the views expressed in this podcast are strictly Stevie James' personal views and do not reflect those of the Alternative Press. So without further ado, I give you part one of my discussion with Stevie James. I just wanted to start with, if you could just give me a little bit of the background of basically how you came to your beliefs. So whether that's, completely for capitalism, just kind of how you started, what changed, what are the main things that influenced you in your background?
Sure. We were kind of talking before we got going here. Started off as conservative by default, just from my parents' perspective. They were atheist conservatives, which is rare, so I kind of just fell in line with that. The more I learned about conservatism, as a young age, like in high school and all that fun stuff, I started to kind of question things and got to the point where I didn't really want to be a conservative, but I definitely wasn't a liberal, that was for sure. Then Ron Paul came around in 2008, and he kind of opened my eyes to there is other options. Started to learn about libertarianism, which is actually just classical liberalism.
Sure.
Was a libertarian for probably about 4 years, I would say, until about 2012 when Ron Paul's second presidential, well, technically his third presidential campaign, his second in the Republican primary, started to die down. The libertarian movement from there, I never lost interest in the issues, but I kind of lost interest in the party affiliation because there's a lot of libertarians that I didn't agree with. So I was kind of on the cusp of it until the final nail in the coffin was most recently when Gary Johnson and Bill Weld came out and said that they were fiscally conservative but socially liberal. To me, that ruins the whole point. They didn't touch on what really libertarianism is based around, and that's the non-aggression principle, which is what brought me into libertarianism in the first place. So as my views have evolved, I would say I'd most accurately be an anarcho-capitalist at this point. The goal is anarchy, essentially. Not anarchy in terms of the general consensus of what anarchy is, chaos and violence and theft and insanity.
Right.
In an anarcho-capitalist society, there's still a small function of government. You could argue that when the founders were writing the Federalist Papers, which led to the Constitution, that's essentially what they were going for, was an anarcho-capitalist society, and they wanted to spread the power out throughout the states so that the federal government would never have too much power to be overbearing, so there could be a focus on local governance, which is kind of what this whole country was based on. But essentially throughout my learning, I didn't go to college, got horrible grades in high school, didn't care, so I'm very much so self-taught. But I've been able to stand on the shoulders of giants before me, as the saying goes.
Yes,
and
it's a great saying.
Yeah, and spent a lot of time primarily studying economics. At a young age, I caught on early on that money makes the world go round. Money is at the root of everything. So I wanted to understand how money worked. I remember asking myself the question in 2007, 2008 of what the hell is money? What is it based on? I assumed it was based on gold or something. Mm-hmm. Turns out it wasn't. It was at one point, right, but it's not anymore. So I dove deeper and deeper into economics. I tried to study the different schools of thoughts. I spent a lot of time studying Keynesian economics, which is mainstream economics. I figured that'd be a good place to start. But kind of like with liberalism and conservatism, I didn't really agree with the premise of its base premise. I didn't really agree that you could use statistical models to predict human behavior. I think that's kind of big-headed and far-sighted to even believe that we could begin to do that. And that's when I kind of, through Ron Paul, discovered Austrian economics, free market economics, and I began to dive really far into that school of thought while still keeping up to date with Keynesianism, reading Paul Krugman, and no matter how hard it was, just to see both sides. But I would say I'm about almost a decade deep into devoutly studying free market economics, and I do believe wholeheartedly that it is the best way to go. So that's about where I'm at politically and economically. I'd say I focus on economics, like to study history, specifically American history, but typically it kind of touches with economics as kind of the main. When I'm looking at history, I'm looking at it through an economic lens, essentially. So that's really where I reside.
So one thing I kind of also wanted to ask you is, when we talked about the other side, so today before we did this, I was preparing and I was listening to a book at work. It was written by the president of the Socialist Party in America. And it was basically his manifesto, whatever, trying to convince you. I had a really hard time getting through it, but it was...
You have to, man. You got to look at it.
It's just one of those things. And so I just wanted to ask you, what merit and what value do you see in the other side? They talked about how capitalism exploits the workers and it's all about profit and inequality and waste and all those talking points. I was wondering, like, what points do you actually see on the other side that actually make sense? So, like, could you give an argument for certain aspects of the other side that you may not necessarily agree with?
I could turn anyone into a socialist. It's easy. I mean, it's the promise of free stuff. I mean, it's beautiful. I mean, of course, like, how could you argue with it on a surface level? It's extremely appealing. I mean, I think the rise of Bernie Sanders made that extremely evident. And I thought it was really funny, as a side note, as a lot of Ron Paul supporters jumped on the Bernie Sanders train, and for me, it was very, I don't think you really
make sense.
I don't think you really get it, you know?
Right.
So I think socialism just comes from a misunderstanding of how capitalism works, and it seems that there's always kind of the burden of capitalism to create some kind of utopian society when that's never been the goal. But anyways, going back to the whole socialism thing, I think it's really easy to make it look appealing because it comes from the promise of free stuff. And I think as you know, insensitive as this may seem, those with low skills, low intelligence, low ability are going to gravitate towards a system that guarantee them something not based on merit or the value they're able to create, but the value that they think they deserve. And that's kind of where the slope gets slippery, is how do you determine needs and desires, you know, quantitatively, which kind of leads to something that I think is funny. I'm not doing a very good job selling socialism, but a point that I think is funny is Keynesian economics always seem to go hand in hand with socialism, but Keynesian economics are so devout on using the statistical equations and coming to a general consensus based on these numbers. But I would argue with socialism, that's impossible to do. One thing you're missing in socialism is the price index to determine what you need and what you don't need. That's the function of prices. If something is in high demand, the prices are going to go down because it's proven that it's in high demand. If something's expensive and in low demand, then it gives a way for manufacturers and people creating value in terms of products and services to determine if they need to create more of them or create less of them. Without the price index and with a central authority controlling it all, can be very difficult to do. But, you know, with the mainstream media and with movies and all that stuff, socialism does look really good. And whenever you see like a futuristic utopian society depicted in the movies, it's always based on socialism. They don't come out and say it, but it's very obviously based on socialism. And I think the big thing with socialism that makes it so appealing is it's kind of in our human nature. If you look throughout history in all the different types of ways that we govern ourselves, we typically tend to go for strong central planning. Maybe not socialism itself early on. It was, you know, kings and serfdom, and then you got into emperors, and then you got into, as it evolved, and you started to see the communists and the socialists and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. So it's human nature we're tribal animals. So we're used to having a leader, we're used to having someone call the shots, and you could argue that the advent of capitalism in Western Europe that bled over into America, and then the America the next step, you could argue that was against human nature. I think it's human nature to want to trust that authority figure, to believe that there is a big brother taking care of you and you have nothing to worry about, because when we were tribal animals throughout evolution, that's how it was. There was someone in charge, someone called the shots, and you took comfort in knowing that that's why you have, alphas and betas and leaders, followers, whatever. It's a natural human tendency. So without, looking deep into the issues, obviously socialism is going to be easy. If you put no thought into it, of course, we've been doing that for all of our lifetimes. Capitalism, in terms of the human experiment, is a very recent phenomenon that took a long time to evolve to the point that it did. It took a lot of thought, a lot of discussion, a lot of radical, crazy, extremist ideas in order to get there. So I would say it's not the natural tendency. So it's easy to be sold on socialism. Free college, free healthcare, a basic minimum pay that you magically get. I mean, everything, of course, that sounds wonderful. Sure. And it's going to sound wonderful to the majority of people because only 40% of people in America actually contribute to the federal tax base in terms of income tax. So if you have 60% of people not paying an income tax, then they don't really give a shit. It's already coming free. So right. Why not perpetuate that further? So it's pretty easy to sell socialism. You're just selling free stuff. I could sell you a free iPod right now, and you would, whether you needed one or not, right. You're going to take it. It's free. I mean, why wouldn't you take it? If you don't want it, throw it in the trash. It's at no extra cost to you. And that's, I'm already starting to illuminate the underlying problems with socialism.
No, that's okay, because that's something I want to get into. So, one thing I learned that, obviously, our millennial generation, I don't like to include myself, but it is what it is. We love Bernie Sanders, and he just absolutely appealed to everything, and it just seemed everybody. He got the biggest crowds, so I wanted to get into it because I truly think that many people are just confused, and they don't really understand the implications of someone like a Bernie Sanders coming in and taking over. Now, I guess one could argue that since the Republicans actually got the Senate and the House and the majority of the governorship, that maybe his ideas wouldn't have gone as far. I wanted to get into, why is it, do you think, that, A, it appeals so much to our generation? Obviously, the free stuff, we all want that. But what is it about the revolution and the ideas, and what is it about that you think appealed to our generation, and do you see it going anywhere?
A really great quote. I wish I could quote its original source, but I think it's pretty prevalent here, is that, see if I can word it the right way, if you're young and not a liberal, you don't have a heart. If you're old and not a conservative, you don't have any money. It's very easy to demand things out of the political process, because essentially government is force, socialism is force. We can get into the details of that. But what you're basically asking for when you're asking for free college is you're asking for someone else to pay for your college. That's the reality of the situation. You're asking for someone else to pay for your shit. That's what it is. And you can make moral arguments all day. Well, then, once you get the job, then you start paying the taxes and it reciprocates in and all this stuff. But I think what ends up happening is as you start making your own money and you start to actually look at how much you're losing to Social Security, how much, you get this nice, you get $1,000 back on your income tax. You're like, the government gave me back $1,000. But if you look a little closer, well, they kept $2,000. They taxed you $3,000. They gave you back $1,000, but they're still keeping $2,000. So as you get older and you start to see this happen, you start to kind of realize how maybe it's not the best idea. But, for the younger generations, like I said, on the surface level, socialism is beautiful. It sounds great. I mean, you watch what Bernie Sanders is saying. It's very empowering. It's very exciting. We got to get the money away from the evil rich people, and we got to give it to the college kids that need it the most. And, I mean, if you're just going to propose, happy, awesome solutions that aren't really based in any truth or reality, it's kind of like the whole time when I'm growing up, everyone's telling me, the real world's going to chew you up and spit you out. The real world's going to chew you up and spit you out. But I think in the past, people grew up and that was the reality. But lately, it's almost like we don't want to accept that reality. So it's kind of delaying it for as long as possible. And I would argue Bernie Sanders' rise is directly correlated with the amount of people that go to college nowadays. People that are funneled directly from high school into college they're not adults yet. They're not contributing. They might have a part-time job or something, but they're not contributing real time to our economic structure, to society. They're just not. It's an extension. College is an extenuation of childhood. That's what it is. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Some people should go to college. Some people shouldn't. It is what it is. It depends what career you want to take on. That's more than fine. Mm-hmm. But when you look at Bernie Sanders' support, you got to look at the numbers and see that almost all of his support is driven by the millennial generation. It's driven by people who are either in high school, in college, doing an undergrad degree, or they dropped out of college and they have all this debt and a shitty job, or they graduated college and have all this debt and a shitty job or no job at all. So when Bernie Sanders comes in and he's got all the solutions to all your problems, and it's not your fault and you don't have to worry about it, and he's going to get the money from someone else, well, then, of course, it sounds beautiful, you know. As someone, for me, who didn't go to college, I graduated high school at 17 and jumped right into the workforce and moved out at 18. I'm hearing all this stuff, and I'm like, wait, I don't have any college debt. How come you guys just got free college all of a sudden? I don't have any debt. I'm already paying my taxes. Why is that going to go to you? So it's a slippery slope, man.
Yeah. No, I get that. So,
but I can see how it appeals to millennials. I'm not at no point to say, like, how could you think this? I 1,000% see how it can be appealing to millennials, 1,000%. But when you dig a little deeper and you look at historical evidence and you start to actually do some math and start to make your own money, kind of starts to look a little different.
Yeah, no doubt. So one thing I also learned, though, is that 1 out of 5 humanities professors in America claim to be Marxists. And also, when you look at like Hollywood, and a lot of them seem to be, I mean, obviously most of them are left-leaning. That's why they call, the liberal Hollywood. But what is it about them? So they obviously have money. How do you think those ideas affect people that do have a little bit of money and do have education? What is it? Do you think they're just appealing to people to make more money, or I don't know? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think ultimately the battle we're having here, if you want to look at the two-sided coin, liberalism and conservatism, what you're having is a battle between the two sides of the brain. One side of the brain is logical, one side of the brain is artistic. I think the right side of your brain is the artistic side, the left side is the logical side.
Right.
So typically, in studies, there's studies that show this. I don't have the sources off the top of my head, but you can look this shit up. Typically, more right-brained artistic people tend to be liberal, because liberal is the political foundation of feel good. That's what it is. It's all about feeling good and virtue signaling and morally doing the right thing. And there's good intentions in there, of course, absolutely. And liberals, played a very powerful role in, like getting like marriage equality and increasing women's rights and all that stuff. And that was very important. And like I said, liberalism evolved out of classical liberalism, which started off with good intentions, but it kind of got a little crazy. And then conservatism is the left side of the brain, logical thinking people. We look at numbers and statistics, and that's why we're more keen to like money and want lower taxes and to keep our own. So if you look at like Hollywood, for example, those are predominantly artistic style people. You don't get into acting as a left brain logical kind of person. I mean, yeah, I'm generalizing here, but typically if the logical side of your brain is firing up, you're going to be an engineer, you're going to be a mathematician, you're going to kind of go into those kind of fields, where if your artistic brain is firing up, you're going to be an actor, a musician, because you could look at the music industry as well is extremely left-leaning, just as Hollywood is, just as art is in general. Like if you go to like an art gallery, you're going to be surrounded by liberals, and so that's really where the battle is happening right now. I think the biggest difference is with social media nowadays. The battle's a little more on the forefront, and typically younger people tend to be more of that still having that expression, that artistic kind of vibe, and it kind of going off the quote I mentioned earlier. When you're younger, you're going to have a bigger heart, you're going to be more liberal. And it's not until you get older, and I think they say like the male brain isn't fully developed until like 25, 26. So it's not until your mid to late 20s that your brain is fully formed how it's going to be in your adult life. So that's not to discredit young people and their thoughts and feelings. We're young people, and we think our opinions are valid. So nothing is absolute, but I think really the battle is between the artistic brain and the reasonable brain, and we have to kind of come together in the middle and be smart about what we're doing. You need to be compassionate, but you also need to be realistic. You need to dream big, but you also need to focus on reality.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm actually a psychology major, and
Excellent.
One of the books I just read recently was by Jonathan Haidt, and in a recent episode I was talking about how people on the left tend to care more about harm and fairness, whereas people on the right, they care about harm and fairness, but they also care about authority and sanctity and the group, and there's other values that go into it as well. And I love how you were talking about how there's people that are definitely just, the different parts of the brain. People are just different. All right, I kind of want to delve into a little bit more of the dark stuff, the fun stuff. So let's talk about what is it, why do you think that the socialist ideas and all those went so wrong in the 20th century? I want to talk about more so the horrors of Mao's China and Stalin, obviously,
Communist Russia,
and the different,
all the good stuff.
Right, all the fun stuff. So I want to get your ideas. So let's start with, what is it do you think about socialism that tends to lead, at least it seems to lead, to these absolute murderous campaigns?
Okay, well, to preface this argument, I'm gonna steal a lesson from my boy Milton Friedman, who was an economic advisor to Reagan. Really excellent conservative economist. Well, he's a classical liberal, so essentially a libertarian. And this lesson has stuck to me forever. I'm pretty sure it's in his book Free to Choose. I could be wrong. I've read a lot of his books, so it's kind of all mesh at this point. But anyways, there's 4 different ways to spend money. Okay, you can spend your money on yourself. When you're spending your money on yourself, you're very concerned with the cost and with the value. So you want it to be the best thing it can be for the lowest possible price when you're spending your money on yourself. Now, you can spend your money on someone else. This is the second way money can be spent. You can spend your money on someone else. So when you're spending your money on someone else, you're still very concerned with the cost. You still want it to be cheap, but you're a lot less concerned with its value, with its quality. That's not as important anymore because it's not for you. And this is just basic human instincts. And again, these are generalizations. And some, I care what I give my friends, whatever. That's fine.
Yeah, it doesn't
Generally
matter.
Speaking, if you spend your money, if I were to buy you a gift, I'm going to be very concerned that it costs as little as possible, but I'm not going to be very concerned with its quality because it's not for me. The third way you can spend money is you can spend someone else's money on yourself. So now that it's someone else's money, you're no longer concerned with the cost of it because it's not your money, but you are again concerned with the value because it's for you. So you don't care how much it costs, but you want the nicest thing possible. Now, the fourth way to spend money, and this is how government spends money, spending someone else's money on someone else. So you don't care what it costs because it's not your money, and you don't care about the quality because it's not for you. So what you end up getting is high cost and low quality, and that's exactly how government functions. And socialism is a big government. So when you're implementing socialism, what you're doing is you're collecting money from the taxpayer, someone else's money, and you are then spending it on someone else. So as the bureaucrat at the top of the chain, you don't really care because it's not your money and you're giving it to people who aren't yourself. And when you are spending the public dollar on yourself, you're spending someone else's money on you. So you're going to buy the most expensive thing possible that's really nice for yourself. And then when you're spending someone else's money on someone else, you're giving them shit. So this is not only the rudimentary force of government, but this is also how socialism functions. You're spending someone else's money on someone else. Someone has to be at the top of socialism to rule this stuff. And putting the word democratic in front of it doesn't make it any more civil or humane. You're just voting for who's going to do it. But yeah, there is no human being that can manage an entire society. It doesn't exist. If God came down, whoever your God is, if he came down, he could run society, sure. But until that happens, it's just not going to work. So I think this fundamental process really applies in the 20th century, especially if you look at, any of the examples, but we'll kind of focus on Russia. I would like to focus even on Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany is the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Hitler came to power as a socialist, and he promised that the workers would stop being exploited by the big corporations and the bankers, and they were going to implement socialist policies. So as he took power, no one likes to talk about this, by the way, because it kind of ruins the whole argument of socialism. I think it's very, as a side note, I think it's really ironic that liberals are calling conservatives Nazis when it's the total. It's literally it's the opposite. They don't want socialism at all. So, anyways, Hitler rose to power by promising the workers fair treatment. A lot of the stuff he said was very similar to what Bernie Sanders was saying. And I'm not saying Bernie Sanders is a Nazi or an evil person. I'm not making that correlation. I'm just using Nazi Germany as an example and how Hitler rose to power. He rose to power by giving the workers a voice, essentially. They were being suppressed by the bankers and the big business. So he came in and he started a lot of public works projects, free education, welfare, like you name it. It poured in. Printed a shit ton of fiat currency to fund the whole thing, and ultimately it's not a consistent way to run a society. And then before, Hitler kind of got lucky because before socialism was able to destroy Germany, he went ahead and tried to take over the world, and that's what ultimately destroyed it for him. So that kind of makes it unsustainable. But going into like Russia and all that fun stuff, basically you eventually run out of other people's money. And without, we talked about it earlier, without the pricing index, you don't know how much stuff to make. And that's why you had like the bread lines in communist Russia and stuff like that. And you know, people will argue, well, Russia was communist. We're talking about socialism. Socialism is
that's one thing I wanted to talk about is the difference, because there's I'm actually curious, like, what do you think is the difference, just real quick?
Socialism is Charmander, communism is Charizard.
That's great. That's beautiful.
Socialism always evolves into communism. It always does. It has to. It just has to. You can make an argument for you can argue that the American family is a communist family. You can have communism or even socialism in very small groups, and that's why it seems natural to create governments that are socialistic. Say I am a father with a wife and 2 kids. I'm going to most likely be controlling the money. I'm going to be controlling the resources and the supplies, and I'm going to give them to my children, and I'm going to ration accordingly and all that stuff. And that's wonderful in the family unit, and I think that's the natural tendency of the family unit. But when you expand that over to a large group of people and you're bringing in 1 million intricate forces, it starts to become unsustainable. Russia didn't have bread lines because they couldn't afford to make bread. They didn't make enough bread because they didn't know how much to make. There's no way to know. The only way to know is with the pricing index, and to let free people compete for it, and to compete for the resources and the money to bring it all together. So socialism is based in force. You can't have socialism without forcing people to participate. You just can't, because if America's like, we're socialists now, and I go, well, I'm not gonna be involved. I'm not gonna partake. Well, you have to, because it doesn't work if we don't have your money. We need everyone's money. It doesn't work. If it's kind of like Social Security. Social Security is socialism. I can't opt out of Social Security because they need my money right now to give it to the older generation. So there is no opting out. I have to be involved. So anything that is rooted in the principle of force, it's going to lead to more force. That's just what's going to happen. So what happens when, people can't eat? When people are hungry, what starts to happen? That's when people start getting crazy and shit starts getting real. You take away the food, you take away the comforts, all of a sudden everything gets really crazy. And that's the biggest problem in the fundamental flaw in socialism and ultimately communism. And you're asking what's the difference between socialism and communism? There isn't one. I mean, socialism is the beginning of communism. That's just what it is. I mean, there's no real fundamental difference. I mean, you can nitpick and make a semantical argument as to the differences, but ultimately it's the same stuff. It's state control of products and services. And like I said before, there is no person or group of people that can possibly know what that is, how much, how little. It's impossible.
Right. And I think that's the beauty of capitalism, is because we're able to adapt to what becomes the best. Anyway, so let's talk about the horrors. What is it that takes all of that and then leads to the murderous campaigns? I guess, a lot of people say the difference is, well, socialism and communism relies force. But just like you were kind of saying, if I don't pay my taxes in 4 or 5 years, men with guns will come to my door and take me away. There's no, so how is that, and that's in modern day capitalist America. And so, so how do you think it leads?
Capitalist America.
Yeah, quote capitalist America.
Yeah.
And so how do you think how does it lead to these massive murderous campaigns? I mean, Mao, killed 20 million people? I mean, just absolute chaos every single time.
Well,
go.
You have to kill dissenters. You have to exile or kill them. Because like I was kind of alluding to previously, if America became a socialist country right now, which, you can argue we've been on the way to that for a long time since the inception of the Federal Reserve, 1913, even before the New Deal. New Deal is not possible without the Federal Reserve. It's a whole other conversation.
Yeah, it's fine.
So if you look at kind of the premise of that argument, how you said if you don't pay your taxes, people with guns come get you. The reason I can't opt out of Social Security is because they need my money to make it work. So in a socialist society, communist society, basically here's how socialist societies become communistic. Socialism happens at first. Everyone's all happy and holding hands and singing Kumbaya, and this is wonderful. But then the production of resources start to get skewed, and people start to feel like they're getting screwed over, and the incentive to work goes down, so do people's work ethic. So then you start to get those bread lines. You start to get dissenters, people that don't want to participate in the process anymore, but they have to participate in the process in order to be able to prolong it. They have to participate. So if they're not willing to participate, then they're not eligible for the benefits, and they got to go. And there's a couple ways to do that. You can exile them, you can murder them, you have to do whatever you can. And that was China's approach, essentially, is you had people that no longer wanted to participate in the system. Can't have that. Got to go. You're dead now. And if you look at Russia, for example, Russia not only was trying to create this perfect society, but they wanted the world to see it, and they wanted to be the leaders of the new world and the leaders of this Karl Marx communist society. And so when it started to not work, they couldn't have people running around saying that it wasn't working. So again, they had to kill those dissenters. And when people came in to like inspect the country and stuff like that, they showed them, they hid the truth. They hid the people that were starving. They hid the people that they were killing, and they showed them the nice stuff, of course. Of course, with socialism and communism, a minority of people do get really nice things. That's a fact. That really happens. And it goes back to the argument, it's because they're spending someone else's money on themselves, so they got this really nice stuff. But then everyone else that they're spending someone else's money on get the short end of the stick, and there's no way to manage the economy. So really, it leads to death because of dissenters. You can't have dissent in a socialist state. You can't. It doesn't work. It won't work. You need full participation.
If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to further the discussion, all information can be found at www.themoraltrigger.com. Be sure to go like the Facebook page at facebook.com/themoraltrigger and comment your opinions to me and others, especially if you disagree. And finally, I hate ads, and to help me avoid using them, consider supporting the show financially through Patreon. Every dollar helps to keep this an open platform and make sure that no one is silenced.